Welcome to the Meteor Instructional Best Practices webinar series. Meteor Education is a leading educational services partner working with education providers to help them create high-impact learning experiences. As one of the largest providers of learning spaces, including furnishings and interior design services, Meteor's focus is the integration of best practices for teaching and learning to drive inquiry-based instruction, effective use of modern classrooms, and increase student achievement. Today we are going to explore clustering math standards to increase rigor. Did you know clustering or bundling standards can increase the rigor of a task? It can be more engaging for students and save the teacher time for more in-depth student learning experiences. One of the biggest challenges for educators is time. We want to provide meaningful in-depth learning experiences for our students, but we sometimes feel like we don't have the time due to the amount of material we need to cover. All states have standards that teachers are responsible for teaching. Students must demonstrate proficiency level for these standards. Most standards have a complexity or depth of knowledge level to indicate the level of student thinking that is required. The key for us as educators and designers of high-impact student experiences is to understand the strategic use of clustering or bundling those standards to deepen students' understanding and to increase rigorous tasks. Based on Meteor's high-impact learning experiences that are an integral part of any unit or lesson design, rigor is a key principle. Rigor is found in learning experiences that challenge students' thinking in new and interesting ways. Rigor is about what students do and is individual to each student's needs. Teachers support students by scaffolding the task from recall to student strategic thinking so that they can be successful and be able to persevere. The other four principles could also be part of clustering and bundling standards. They would include authentic inquiry, inclusiveness, respectful collaboration, and ownership. So in order to create these high-impact learning experiences by clustering or bundling standards, we need to be deliberate and strategic in the teacher action, what the teacher says and does in the classroom, and the student action, what we expect students to say and do in the classroom. The deliberate actions that are necessary for the types of learning experiences are aligned to the research of John Hattie's visible learning. We know that John Hattie's research resulted in specific indicators for success as noted here. If we take a look at what his work cites as having a direct impact on student achievement at a 0.4 or above, we notice the following connect to clustering or bundling standards for rigorous learning experiences. They would be teacher expectations of students, depth of conceptual knowledge, complex task analysis, and academic discussions. Before we begin to talk about how to cluster or bundle standards, we need to review complexity or depth of knowledge that calculates the cognitive demand of the standard and ultimately the task or learning experience that is created for students. The four levels are these: DOK1, recall and reproduction. You either know it or you don't. DOK2, application of skills and concepts. That's book knowledge and procedures. DOK3, strategic thinking. This is an original idea where students are uncovering new information. And DOK4, extended thinking. This is a research application to something students have not seen before. One deliberate action for us as educators is to look at the ceiling of the standard. The ceiling means that you must provide task or learning experiences at that complexity or DOK level. In other words, the learning experiences for students need to require that level of student thinking. If the ceiling is at a complexity or DOK level of 3, student strategic thinking, then the task or learning experience must match that level of thinking. It may also be necessary to create tasks at the DOK 1 and 2 to scaffold the learning to that DOK 3 ceiling. But the key is that the DOK level gives educators the target for students to demonstrate proficiency at that particular standard. Here are a couple of examples. Here you notice that this first standard states, create equations in 2 or more variables to represent relationships between quantities. graph equations on coordinate axis with labels and scales. The cognitive complexity ceiling level is 2, basic application of skills and concepts. The second standard states, represent constraints by equations or inequalities and by systems of equations and/or inequalities, and interpret solutions as viable or non-viable options in a modeling context. For example, represent inequalities describing nutritional and cost constraints on combinations of different foods. This standard has a cognitive complexity of 3, strategic thinking and complex reasoning. Again, that at times you may need to provide scaffolding tasks up to that ceiling, and in this case it would be a DOK 3, for students to become proficient. So what do the various levels of student thinking look like in the classroom? If the ceiling of the task is at a complexity DOK 1 level, then the student is providing one right answer and he or she is recalling information. At a DOK 2, application of concepts and skills, teachers have students act on information they have memorized or learned from level 1. Student actions will include understanding relationships of concepts and the ability to classify or organize information. At a DOK 2 level experience, students usually must use more than one step to get to the one answer. At DOK 3, strategic thinking, teachers provide tasks for students that need reasoning. Students are required to plan a strategy drawn on prior learning. At this level, the task a teacher provides has multiple answers and/or multiple pathways to correct answers. Student answers will require an explanation of their thinking. At DOK 4, extended thinking, teachers provide opportunities for students to take information and synthesize it in a unique way. Students' actions include complex reasoning, planning, and an investigation or application of solutions to real-world problems or issues. Let's take a look at some math problems. Here's a typical math problem. It states, how many edges does the figure above have? This is a task at a depth of knowledge 1. This is basic recall and reproduction. This task simply asks students to recall the definition of an edge and count the edges that are illustrated in the figure. This second problem states, a survey shows that 55% of the registered voters in Plainville voted on the school budget proposal. Of those who voted, 62% voted to pass the school budget. What is the probability that a registered voter chosen at random voted to pass the school budget? This is a routine problem that requires multiple steps to solve, so it is considered a depth of knowledge 2 task. This third problem requires students to solve and explain or justify their reasoning. It states, think carefully about the following question. Write a complete answer. You may use drawings, words, and numbers to explain your answer. Be sure to show all of your work. Laura wanted to enter the number 8375 into her calculator. By mistake, she entered the number 8275. Without clearing the calculator, how could she correct her mistake? Without clearing the calculator, how could she correct her mistake another way? This is a DOK 3 math task, an activity that has more than one possible answer and requires students to justify the response they give would most likely be at that DOK 3 level. Since there are multiple possible approaches to this problem, the student must make strategic decisions about how to proceed, which is more cognitively complex than simply applying a set procedure or skill. This final task states, work with a partner. You are planning to make and sell 3 different sizes of cylindrical candles. You buy 1 cubic foot of candle wax for $20 to make 8 candles of each size. A. Design the candles. What are the dimensions of each size of candle? B. You want to make a profit of $100. Decide on a price for each size of candle. And C. Did you set the prices so that they are proportional to the volume of each size of candle? Why or why not? This is a DOK 4 task. In a DOK 4, the focus is requiring complex reasoning, planning, and thinking for the investigation. The cognitive demand of the task should be high and the work should be very complex with multiple steps. Students should be required to make several connections, relate ideas within the content area, and to have to select one approach among several alternatives on how the problem should be solved. Level 4 activities include designing and conducting experiments, developing, improving, and making connections. As you have seen, individual tasks or questions have a DOK level. So how do we cluster or bundle math standards in order to raise the rigor of a task, especially if a math task is at a depth of knowledge level of a 1 or 2? A great place to start bundling or clustering is to bundle the math content standards to a math practice standard. There are 8 math practice standards that all teachers in all grades and math content areas should be aligning tasks to. They include make sense of problems and persevere in solving them, reason abstractly and quantitatively, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others, model with mathematics, use appropriate tools strategically, attend to precision, look for and make use of structure, and look for and express regularity in repeated reasoning. By starting with the content standards and then including the math practice standards in a unit or lesson, we are being deliberate and strategic to cluster and at the same time increase the depth of knowledge ceiling that would increase the rigor of a task. And as you can see here, these are not considered extra or supportive standards. These math practice standards will be incorporated in state exams. They are as important as the content for student success. So let's take a look at how to redesign a task by clustering a content standard with a math practice standard. Here is a task that you might see in Algebra 1. It states, a taxi service charges a $10 flat fee plus $3 per mile. Create a graph representing the situation. This task is a depth of knowledge 2. It is aligned to one specific algebra content standard, and that has a depth of knowledge 2 level, basic applications of skills. Now I'm going to take that math content standard and cluster it with a math practice standard, model with mathematics. To increase the rigor of the previous task, I'm going to include the statement, could you have improved the model? This question requires students to justify or defend their process for creating a model, and we know that when students have to justify or defend an answer or their perspective, the complexity or depth of knowledge of the task has been raised to a depth of knowledge 3. Here is the new question. It includes the algebra content standard and the math practice standard. I have bundled these two to raise the rigor. The question now states, a taxi service charges a $10 flat fee plus $3 per mile. Create a graph representing the situation. The following model was created to represent the problem. How could you improve this model? Justify your answer using mathematical reasoning. This task, although similar to the previous task, can now be increased to a depth of knowledge level of 3 just by clustering the two standards. This clustering or bundling of standards can be done with all math courses and grade levels. Let's go back to our high-impact learning experiences and make connections. As you can see, when we cluster or bundle standards, we are addressing rigor. Rigor, again, is those learning experiences that challenge students' thinking in new and interesting ways. Rigor is about what students do and is individual to each student's needs. The other 4 principles could also be a part of clustering or bundling standards. Authentic inquiry is about real-world relevant questions or tasks, usually a problem or issue in the community or world where students ask questions they want to answer, research possible answers or solutions, and back it up with evidence from various sources. Inclusiveness, that's where all students, from struggling students to high achievers, are involved and actively engaged in the task or experience. Respectful collaboration. That's productive student conversations that build collaboration and a culture of mutual respect within a classroom. These conversations allow students to deepen their understanding, refine their thinking, and use appropriate strategies to challenge or argue and defend their viewpoint with peers. And finally, ownership. This is the investment a learner has in his or her learning. Students take ownership when they are engaged in meaningful experiences through student-generated questions that they care about, setting goals, solving real-world problems and issues. Here are some questions for you and/or your team to discuss based on this short webinar. How does clustering or bundling standards increase the rigor of the task, become more engaging for students, and save the teacher time for more in-depth student learning experiences? How deliberate are you in clustering standards, including math practice standards, within a unit of study? What deliberate actions do you plan to put into place to create student learning experiences aligned to the ceiling of the standards? Also, additional resources on this topic can be found in your resource folder. This webinar series is brought to you by Meteor Education and the Center for College and Career Readiness. For more information about how Meteor Education can help you develop high-impact learning experiences, go to meteoreducation.com.